Have you ever wondered how my mother fed 6 hungry children with nothing but a bag of flour, 3 potatoes, and a jar of pork fat? Today, people cry when they can't afford expensive meat, but in the 1960s, we had no money and we ate like kings. The secret wasn't in the pantry, it was in the pages of a grease-stained notebook from 1950. Today, I'm opening Doña Benedita's secrets to show you how to feed a family for pennies and never lack a thing. I remember the kitchen of 1965 as if I were standing in it right now. The linoleum floor was peeling at the edges, curling up like old parchment, and the single window above the sink let in a stripe of late afternoon light that turned the steam from the stovetop into something almost holy. The walls had a film of grease on them that no amount of scrubbing could remove, and the ceiling was yellowed from years of smoke rising from the cast iron skillet that sat on the burner like a throne. That skillet belonged to Doña Benedita, my mother, and it was never truly clean because she believed the seasoning of 1,000 meals gave it a flavor that no store-bought pan could replicate. She was right. Everything that came out of that skillet tasted like memory itself, like the accumulated patience of a woman who could turn air into supper. It was a Friday night, the last Friday before payday, and the cupboard was what most people today would call empty. There was a quarter bag of flour, some dried beans at the bottom of a tin, a few potatoes with eyes sprouting from them like tiny green fingers reaching for the light, a jar of lard that was halfway down, and a heel of bread so stale it could have been used as a doorstop. I was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with my 5 siblings, and I remember the specific sound of my younger brother's stomach growling, a low, rolling thunder that seemed too loud for his small body. My father was at the factory for overtime, and we were hungry in the way that children are hungry, which is to say, desperately and without the adult ability to rationalize the wait. But my mother did not panic. She never panicked. She reached up to the shelf above the stove and pulled down the notebook. It was a composition book with a black and white marbled cover, but you could barely see the pattern anymore because it was stained with lard and flour and tomato. The pages were swollen and wavy from moisture, and some were stuck together with dried egg. That notebook was my grandmother's before it was my mother's, started during the war when feeding a family was an act of warfare against starvation. My mother opened it to a page she knew by heart, but she opened it anyway, because the ritual was part of the magic. She ran her finger down the page, her lips moving silently, and then she looked at us and said, "Tonight we eat like royalty." The first trick my mother performed that night, and every night when the cupboard was bare, was the resurrection of stale bread. She took that rock-hard heel, and she did not throw it away the way people today throw away bread that is one day past its purchase date. She held it under the tap for just a moment, letting the water kiss the crust, and then she placed it directly on the burner grate, turning it with her bare fingers that were so calloused from years of kitchen work that she could handle hot coals without flinching. The bread came back to life. The crust crackled, the inside softened, and when she tore it open, steam rose from its heart like a small prayer. But that was only the beginning. She took the rest of the stale bread, the crumbs and the crust she had been saving all week in a cloth bag hanging from a nail, and she grated them into fine crumbs on the old box grater. Those breadcrumbs became the coating for fried potato cakes, the thickener for soup, the base for a bread pudding that we ate for dessert. Nothing was wasted. The bread did not die in our house. It was reincarnated. The second trick was the lard. Today people speak of lard as if it were poison, as if our grandmothers were slowly killing us with every spoonful. But when you have nothing, fat is everything. Fat is flavor. Fat is satiety. Fat is the difference between a meal that leaves you hungry an hour later and one that carries you through to morning. My mother kept the lard in a ceramic crock with a wooden lid, and every time she cooked pork, she saved every drop of rendered fat, straining it through a cloth with the reverence of a woman pouring holy water. That lard went into everything, the foundation of her cooking. She would melt a spoonful in the skillet, and the kitchen would fill with a smell that was rich and warm and animal, a smell that told your body you were about to be fed. She fried onions in it until they were golden, and those onions became the beginning of every soup, every stew, every sauce. The lard cost nothing because it was a byproduct, a thing that modern cooks pour down the drain. My mother would have wept to see good fat thrown away. The third trick was thickening. When you have very little food, the illusion of abundance matters almost as much as the substance. My mother could take a thin, watery broth and turn it into something that looked and felt like a rich, hearty stew, and she did it with nothing more than flour and water. She would mix a tablespoon of flour with cold water in a cup, stirring it with a fork until it was smooth, and then she would pour it slowly into the simmering pot, stirring constantly. The broth would thicken and become opaque, clinging to the spoon, and suddenly what had been a sad puddle of water with a few vegetables floating in it became something that filled a bowl and filled a stomach. She called it giving body to the broth, and she said it with the same pride an artist might use when describing the final brushstroke on a painting. Sometimes she would add a beaten egg to the thickened broth, letting it form ribbons of protein that made the soup look rich and elegant. A handful of flour, an egg if we had one, and water from the tap. That was the recipe for dignity. The fourth trick required patience, a currency my mother possessed in greater quantities than money. She bought the cheapest cuts, the shanks and necks and feet and tails, parts with more bone and gristle than flesh. She put them in her biggest pot with water and whatever vegetables she had, and she set it on the lowest flame for 4, 5, sometimes 6 hours. The kitchen filled with a steam so thick and fragrant it was almost a meal in itself. The collagen broke down into the broth, turning it silky and rich. The meat, which had started tough as leather, became so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. What the rich bought as prime cuts, we achieved through the alchemy of time. My mother knew that time was the only ingredient she had in abundance, and she spent it wisely. The fifth trick was what she called stone soup, though there was no stone involved. It was the philosophy of making something from nothing, of looking at what most people would call garbage and seeing a meal. She kept a pot on the back of the stove, and throughout the day every scrap went into it. The tops of carrots, the ends of onions, the wilted outer leaves of lettuce, the water left over from boiling potatoes, the bones from last night's chicken if we had been lucky enough to have chicken. By evening, that pot of scraps had become a broth of surprising depth and complexity. She would strain it, add whatever she had, perhaps some of those sprouting potatoes, diced and fried in lard, perhaps some of the thickening flour mixture, perhaps a handful of those miraculous breadcrumbs, and she would serve it as soup. We ate that soup nearly every night, and it was never the same twice, and it was always good, and it always filled us up. My neighbors were starving because they did not know how to cook a stone, while my children had bellies full of warmth. Doña Benedita knew that a full stomach is the first step to a proud heart. I have digitized her entire 1960s economy manual into an e-book for you in the pinned comment. It is your defense against rising prices. The sixth trick grew on our windowsill. My mother kept small pots and old tin cans lined up along the kitchen window, and in them she grew herbs. Parsley, chives, mint, oregano, thyme. She could not afford to buy fresh herbs at the market, so she grew them herself, pinching off leaves as she needed them, dropping them into pots and skillets where they released their fragrance like tiny green explosions of flavor. That windowsill garden transformed her cooking from mere sustenance into something that tasted intentional, something that tasted seasoned and considered. She would rub the herbs between her palms before adding them, crushing the cells to release the oils, and the kitchen would fill with a green, living scent that cut through the heaviness of the lard and the flour. Those herbs cost nothing after the initial planting. They just needed sunlight and water and the occasional murmured encouragement that my mother gave them as she watered them each morning with a dented tin cup. The seventh trick came at the end of market day. My mother went to the open-air market on Saturday afternoon, not in the morning when prices were high, but in the last hour before vendors packed up. She walked among the stalls with her cloth bag and bought the bruised tomatoes, the wilted greens, the overripe fruits, vegetables one day from being thrown in the gutter. She bought them for almost nothing. Sometimes vendors gave them for free just to avoid carrying them home. The bruised tomatoes became sauce, cooked down with onions and lard and herbs until they were thick and sweet. The wilted greens were chopped and sautéed. The overripe fruits became preserves and jams, cooked with sugar until dark and glossy, and stored in old jars for months. She pickled what could be pickled, dried what could be dried. Her pantry was lined with jars of end-of-market treasures transformed into provisions against the lean days she knew would come. The eighth trick was the coffee that was not coffee. Real coffee was a luxury that appeared only when my father received a bonus or a relative brought a bag as a gift. On ordinary days, my mother made coffee from roasted barley and chicory root. She roasted the barley grains in a dry skillet, shaking constantly until they were dark and crackling, then ground them in the old hand-cranked grinder from the old country. Mixed and brewed in the dented enamel pot, it produced a dark, bitter, earthy drink that was not coffee but close enough. We drank it with sugar if we had it, or plain if we did not, wrapping our hands around warm cups. It was the ritual that mattered more than the bean, the act of sitting together with a hot drink at the end of the day. The ninth trick was what my mother did with fruit peels. When she made those end-of-market preserves, or when she peeled apples or oranges or the occasional lemon, she saved every scrap of peel. Orange peels were dried on a rack near the stove and then simmered in sugar water until they became candied, translucent and chewy and intensely sweet, a candy that cost nothing and tasted like sunshine. Apple peels were cooked with cinnamon and a little sugar into a compote that we ate as dessert or spread on bread. Lemon peels were grated into batters and doughs, giving cakes and cookies a bright, sharp flavor that made them taste expensive. She even boiled banana peels with sugar and vanilla to make a thick, caramel-colored sweet that we ate with spoons from small bowls. The peels that most people threw away were our confectionery, our treat, the proof that sweetness could be extracted from the parts of food that the world considered worthless. The 10th trick, the most sacred rule in Doña Benedita's notebook, was the one-pot meal. A single large pot containing a starch, a protein, and a vegetable, all cooked together, was the most efficient way to feed a family. She did not make separate dishes or side courses. She made one pot of food, and that pot fed all of us. Rice and beans with a piece of sausage and greens, potatoes and cabbage, and the last scrapings of meat from a bone, simmered in broth thickened with flour. Pasta cooked in the same water as the vegetables, tossed with lard and breadcrumbs and herbs. One pot, one flame, one meal. It saved fuel, it saved time, and it saved food, because when everything cooked together, the flavors merged and nothing was lost. The one-pot meal was not a limitation, it was a philosophy of wholeness, a statement that a family needs one good pot and the knowledge of how to fill it. I am 65 years old now, and I have a refrigerator full of food and a pantry stocked with things my mother could not have imagined. And yet, I still cook the way she taught me. I still save my bread crusts. I still keep a jar of rendered fat by the stove. I still grow herbs on my windowsill. I still go to the market at closing time. Every time I lift the lid of a simmering pot and breathe in the steam, I am 12 years old again, sitting at that kitchen table with its peeling linoleum, watching my mother perform her miracles. The notebook sits in my kitchen drawer now. The cover is obscured by stains, and some pages are so fragile I am afraid to turn them. I have copied every recipe into a new book and given copies to my children and grandchildren. But the original stays with me, because it is not just recipes. It is a record of survival, proof that a woman with almost nothing could feed a family with dignity and love and even joy. The kitchen is not a place of drudgery, but a laboratory of invention, where scarcity becomes abundance through knowledge and patience and care. People today look at full refrigerators and say there is nothing to eat, then pick up their phones and order food in a cardboard box, food made by strangers, food that costs in one meal what my mother spent in a week. They have lost the knowledge, and in losing it, they have lost the power. They are dependent on a system that charges them dearly for the privilege of being fed, when they could feed themselves for almost nothing if they only knew how. My mother knew how, her mother knew how, and now you know how, because these tricks are not secrets, they are inheritance, and inheritance is meant to be shared. The cast iron skillet still sits on my stove. It is black and heavy and smooth from decades of use, and when I heat it and drop in a spoonful of lard, it sings. It sings with the voice of my mother and my grandmother and all the women before them who stood in kitchens with empty cupboards and full hearts, and fed their families with nothing but wit and will and the ancient sacred knowledge that food is not about ingredients. Food is about what you do with what you have. And if you have a bag of flour, 3 potatoes, and a jar of pork fat, you have everything you need.